On this episode of the Naturist Living Show, Naturist Architecture.
This episode of the Naturist Living Show is brought to you by Bare Oaks Family Naturist Park. At Bare Oaks, we offer traditional naturist values in a modern setting. Free your body, free your mind. www.bareoaks.ca.
Welcome, dear listener, to episode number 83 of the Naturist Living Show. I mentioned in the last one that I had another business in architecture and construction business, but design professionals, so interior designers as well, and engineers. We do education for them, and that's the funny part about that is that I ran across an article a little while ago that seemed to combine both my passion for naturism and my business at Bare Oaks and my aecdaily.com business on architecture. There is an associate professor of history at California State University, Long Beach, Sarah Schrank, and she wrote an article in the July 2012 issue of the Journal of Urban History called Naked Houses, The Architecture of Nudism and the Rethinking of the American Suburbs. And that caught my eye, first because that was an interesting topic, which is what we're talking about today. But also because it fit with what I'm doing. I mean, I do like architecture. That's why I'm involved in that other business. And it was an interesting idea. It was also a product of the fact that I'm doing research at the University of Toronto as part of my the course that I'm teaching there, and also my continuing interest in the academic side of naturism as well. So all of those came together to find this particular article, and I read it. It was very interesting. I mean, architecture is influenced in many ways. It's generally not that different for naturism, but there are things that are unique. You know, certainly for Bare Oaks, we don't have gendered-specific washrooms. Now, that's not specific to naturism. That's a trend in some places right now as well. And also, I've been to naturist parks and nudist parks that have gender-specific washrooms, but you definitely don't need them when you're used to seeing each other nude, in my opinion. Showers, I mean, generally all places have combined mixed gender showers that I've ever been to. They can be outdoors without any screening. I always tell the other campground owners in Ontario that I have the least expensive showers to build. You put a post, hot and cold water, and you've got a shower. You don't need, screening or shields or anything like that. So, and people prefer it. I certainly prefer to shower outside as well. You need a place to undress, and that's not common everywhere, but it is something that I think is important, and I'm going to be implementing in the redesign of the main building. That transition space where you take your clothes off, you find it in public pools, right? You generally walk through the locker room to get to the public pool. And that makes a lot of sense for a naturist place as well in the main buildings or near the entrance. You need a place to change. People don't necessarily like to change in public or in their car, and certainly if it's cold, that's a problem. So locker rooms is another example. Dealing with the general public is an issue that has impacted how people design naturist places, because especially in the early 20th century, you could not be nude when suppliers were coming, or the general public was coming to deal with things, delivery people, that kind of thing. So there was usually a separation, perhaps so a building further at the front or a long driveway and hiding it. It's not an issue at Bare Oaks. We don't do that at all. People say, well, what about people who deliver? Well, they're the ones who are uncomfortable, and they just have to deal with it. And nobody's ever well, that's not true. One company had a problem with one delivery person refusing to, in 10 years, had refused to deliver to Bare Oaks because of the nudity. But generally, it's not a problem, and the staff is plenty comfortable, as you've heard in past episodes. It's almost kind of a sport for them. There's other issues that have impacted design, not necessarily naturist or nudity-specific issues, but I've seen some interesting stuff. So, for example, Glen Echo had cabins that were narrower at the floor than and they got wider. And the reason they did that is because of a building code issue that says that over 100 square feet you have to have a building permit. So they would build a floor space that's 100 square feet, and then it would get wider to have more space in the cabin. It made some interesting designs actually as a result. So, and money, that's also caused some interesting design consideration when there's limitations, but again, not specifically specific. Privacy is an issue that has affected a lot of the design in naturist clubs, because you in most places you can't be seen from the road. In fact, in France for a long time, the rule was you had to have a double shield, so maybe a couple of fences or a wall and a fence or something like that, in order to make sure you were consistent with the law. And in the homes, we had specific requirements, because people, of course, generally did not live in naturist parks or resorts. They lived in homes, and there's a number of articles that have been done. The image for the podcast is of the Mason family. You can see their backyard, and the backyard, they bought the house specifically for it, but then designed the yard around it. But as Sarah points out in her article, some people even went as far as designing houses specifically for naturists, which are very interesting. So I gave her a call because I wanted to talk more about it. The article is actually as much about the sociology of naturism, the evolution of the ideas, of where it came from and where it ended up with and how it diverged. It's actually a very good summary of that. And as you can tell from her title, she's a history professor. But the architecture puts an interesting lens on that story, and she does bring in some really interesting stories and shows floor plans of houses that were done specifically for naturist or nudist families. So I gave her a call. We actually had a lot in common. Besides the architecture, she speaks French fluently. She's Canadian, as it turns out, despite being in California. And she has an interest in naturism. So I'm not sure if I can find another person that would have 4 things like that in common with me. But she did, and we had a nice chat, as you'll hear. So why don't we start, if you can just introduce yourself and your position and what you do?
Sure. My name is Sarah Schrank. I'm professor of history at Cal State University Long Beach, and I teach courses in American urban, cultural, and gender history. And I also do specialty classes on the history of the body, the history of popular environmentalism, and public art and monumentality.
Wow, that's quite a broad range of interesting topics.
Thank you. It is. They've evolved over time, and to me, they make a lot of sense together, because it's really about understanding modernity and looking at these different types of sites, whether they be cities or bodies or artwork, as sort of the sites by which people have understood their position in the world.
Well, and from all that, you wrote a very interesting journal article that I found and I used in my class at the University of Toronto called, I don't remember the title of the article, but it's on nudity and naturism and nudism and architecture.
Yes, that piece is called Naked Houses, the Architecture of Nudism and the Rethinking of the American Suburbs. And it was a piece that I wrote when I first started working on the book that I'm completing now, called Free and Natural, Naked Living in the American Cult of the Body, that the University of Pennsylvania Press will be publishing next year. And that book essentially came out of my previous work on Los Angeles and sort of fights over modern art in the city. And when I finished the first book, I started thinking about how, when people think about Los Angeles in the 1950s, in the middle of the 20th century, they often thought of it as a cultural center, a media center, an arts center. And I thought, well, in the late 20th and early 21st century, how did people think about Southern California? And I thought they think of it as a place for different types of bodies, the way people look. And that's kind of the more appropriate trope for thinking about this place. And that led me to like a much larger set of questions about why do people think about the West as so associated with body culture? And then this was very, very kind of early days in this project on nudism, but I started asking questions about, is it possible to find a body culture that isn't simply about narcissism and exercise? And that kind of landed me in the Nudist archives in South Florida. And it was through that I ended up writing this piece on the architecture of nudism and leading to my later book project. So that's sort of the trend. That's how I got from art in LA to naked architecture in Tampa, Florida, if that makes any sense at all.
It does make sense, although, and that's a very narrow field, the architecture. Frankly, I'm surprised you were able to write as good and as interesting of an article because I didn't know there was that much material on it. But so how did you happen to connect to that topic? Because it doesn't sound like architecture is specifically anything you're normally working on.
Well, I did write about architecture in the sense I was interested in vernacular artworks that people build in their own kind of backyards. So the art I write about in my original projects from some time ago were often formal art that you'd see in museums and public art that you'd see, public sculpture, but also vernacular modern art, things like the Watchtowers, which you may have heard of, that were built by an immigrant Italian in the 1920s and 1930s. But that's not what I went into the nudist stuff thinking about. It was more what happened as I was reading thousands of nudist magazines, which are, of course, this kind of wonderful visual trove of material about this subculture. And I noticed one of the things I started really noticing in the stuff in the 1950s was how suburban some of the representations of naked living were and how much interest people had in both showcasing the insides of their homes, but also designs for taking cheap suburban houses and turning them into kind of landscapes for everyday naked living. And people weren't necessarily saying that specifically in the magazine articles, but I could sort of see it through the visual culture as it was displayed. And because of previous research I'd done in thinking about this broader body project, I'd studied the works of Schindler and Richard Neutra and other modernist architects who were interested in the relationship of the body to sunlight, to space. And so I started seeing connections between this kind of high modernist body architecture and this kind of more vernacular stuff on the ground. And that's sort of how I started seeing the things connected.
Now, it's interesting that you said that it was mostly suburban. Do you have any theories as to why it was focused on that?
I do, largely because urban architecture and urban spaces were not particularly welcoming to nudist living. That I know in the United States, and that's really the context in which I've worked, organized nudists coming out of the various nudist organizations had, tried to get nude beaches allocated as early as the 1930s in places like Chicago, also a little bit later in Los Angeles, and were really unable to do so. So you have a kind of retrenchment of nudists and naturists into rural areas in the 1930s, 1940s, because they were having so much trouble getting spaces in cities. And if they did try to live nakedly and were seen, could be arrested for that, and often were. And so the rural areas were safer. And so this is when people start buying up land and having private spaces and private camps. And even those would still cause problems for local law enforcement. And so once suburbia really started to grow astronomically in the 1950s and 1960s, people had the space. They had a great deal of privacy because the way American suburbia was constructed was really about atomized family living. So you can if you close your garage and you build your high fence, people can't really see you. And it produced a type of space in which the naked living could be done without too much surveillance. And so I think that's largely why suburbia was so useful for this type of kind of natural living experiment.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what did you find in terms of naturist or nudist architecture?
I found that people are really creative, and I found a lot of do-it-yourself sorts of projects. So what people often did, they'd start with backyards, and particularly if they were in places like Florida or California, where the weather is pretty good all year round, there was a sort of effort to try to have indoor-outdoor living. And this, of course, was kind of, certainly in Southern California, was kind of part of what was on deck for the lifestyle here anyway, whether or not you were a nudist. The idea that you could kind of move inside and outside your house pretty seamlessly. And wealthy people had long commissioned houses that allowed you to do that. But suburban houses with sliding doors and decks and things in the backyard allowed people to do it too. To kind of convert them into nudist houses involved making fences higher. And so sometimes people just built higher fences, and other times they would take fiberglass and just add it to the top of a wooden fence and sort of just make it another couple feet taller to prevent neighbors from looking in. The other thing people did was kind of build front lobbies that were in their houses that were kind of closed off, and they'd put their front hallways at slightly offset angles. And the purpose of that was that if someone came to the door unexpectedly, like the UPS guy, someone could go answer the door without everyone else inside having to get dressed, because the sight lines were cut off. But they weren't cut off in such a way as to look suspicious or awkward. People also built skylights into their houses. Sometimes people did manage to put in indoor pools, although their houses had to be of fair size to be able to do that. And so just lots of things like that, a lot of enclosed patios. And so much of it was about trying to get the body exposed to sun, as well as being able to live nakedly without having people see you.
Did you see any of that for outside of the United States, or were you just not looking in Europe or any of that?
I really focused my attention on the American context, because those are the sources that I had. I have trouble believing that people in Europe didn't do similar types of things, but the story of American suburbia is on such an enormous scale that I had so much more to work with. But I suspect that you could find similar types of projects in parts of Europe as well, where the climate would allow it, for sure.
And the journal articles seem to focus on these kinds of projects mostly in the 60s, 70s, maybe 80s a little bit, but not recently. Is it because you think it's stopped?
I would say I think it's changed. And my weigh in on this is that, first of all, there seem to be a lot more private places for people to go to be naked if they want to. So the resort culture around American nudism has really taken off in the last 20 years. And so for people, in some ways there's not such a demand to refurbish one's own home, but there's lots of places to go. And for a certain demographic of people with the money to go to resorts, there are plenty of them, thousands of them. And it's kind of part of a new resort nudist tourism that I think is pretty big in Europe as well. It probably has been for much longer than it's been in the United States, but that's certainly been true for the last couple of decades. So in some ways, there are other places to go, and you aren't just restricted to your own house. But in addition, in Tampa, Florida, for example, which was kind of ground zero for nudist suburbia in the United States, starting in the 1940s and 50s, those places are still there. Land O'Lakes and I forget a couple of the other sort of prefab suburbs. Some of them are prefab suburbs. Others are actually trailer parks that evolved into proper houses and proper suburbs, are still there and very large, and with thousands of residents. And those are pretty much entirely nudist. So it is still happening, and it does seem to be a growing interest. In fact, it was actually the subject of a reality TV show here in the United States just a couple years ago. I don't remember what it was called, but it was about...
It's called Buying Naked.
Buying Naked with
Yes.
Jackie Youngblood, I believe.
That's right.
And so that's true. That is a realistic depiction. And the interesting thing is those suburbs go back to before World War II, when they were simply camps. And then as Tampa and the suburbia grew up around the part of Florida, it's not really southern Florida, the suburban sort of landscape just took hold.
Yeah, I don't know if you ran across this. There's also a neighborhood in the Tampa area that was built where the street is on the outside, but all of their backyards are linked. It's like a semicircle crescent, and they have a joined area that is nudist, and so it's kind of a shared space, but it means that you can have your grandchildren come over and they are not exposed, pardon the pun, to the nudist aspect.
That's really interesting, and that makes perfect sense to me. And that would be the place where I would imagine that that the culture has been around for long enough that those types of changes could be made to the built environment to allow just that. Like you can expose those who want to be and protect those. I guess I'm not sure that's really the right word, but not expose those you don't want to.
Now, what you're describing to me also suggests a change, because you're talking about places to go, vacation, leisure, but the nudism, naturism of the Maurice Parmelee times would be something you'd want to do at home as well, which is why when people are changing their homes, it's a way of life. But are you seeing then a shift where it's no longer a way of life?
Well, it's hard for me to answer to a certain degree because I'm myself am not a practicing nudist, and those that I meet do practice still at home, and so they live in houses that allow for that type of living, where again people are protected from the view of neighbors, but they do seem to spend a lot of time at nudist camps and colonies, which in some ways was actually the original nudists in the United States in the late 20s and 30s, like Maurice Parmelee, encouraged both. And Parmelee referred to it as domestic. With the stuff that you did at home was called domestic nudism, and it was this way of like making sure that it was this lifestyle all the time. And I do think people are still doing that. But the way that I was studying this material for the article was through, this incredible, rich outpouring of nudist magazines, which existed throughout the 50s, 60s, and into the early 70s, but we don't actually have that type of cultural output any longer. Largely that was tied to shifts in how pornography was published in the United States. And nudist magazines actually lost a lot of viewers because there was a Purian gaze involved in collecting them, which is one of the reasons why people could sell so many of them. And so the nudist magazines kind of tapered off, and you didn't have as many of them. There used to be dozens of them, and they had circulations of 60, 70,000 per magazine. So it was a huge sort of cultural facet of nudist culture where a lot of these ideas could get shared. And that's how I can sort of see the culture unfolding. And that's really shrunk up tremendously.
Yes, and you could question as well, I guess, as you quite correctly said, there were a lot of magazines being sold because a lot of people buying them were not naturists or nudists. They were buying it for a prurient interest. So was the content you were reading geared towards that audience or towards the actual people who were in the movement?
Overwhelmingly, the material in the magazines was absolutely for people who are practicing nudists and naturists. No question. Every issue pretty much had treatises on that the purposes of naked living wasn't just about being naked, and it wasn't even necessarily about the body per se, but it was about health. It was about kind of trying to shed the culture of, the uptight sexual mores that sort of twisted people up and made them unhappy and made the society problematic. It was about also trying to shed class differences. So much of social class is demarcated by clothing and jewelry and all these sort of outside props. And part of naturism and nudity and nudism was about shedding those things. So it was a lot about health, and it was about sort of democracy and trying to imagine a socially more equitable world. And a lot of the magazines really talked a lot about that. And in fact, there's a lot of text. And the pictures tend to be about the body and nature, about families and family togetherness. And so it'd be very difficult to see it as pornography at all. Some of the magazines, though, did have more homoerotic content where you'd have particularly like sort of naked men together, not performing anything that would be seen as pornographic by certainly any contemporary standard. But given that this was a lot of these magazines were published in the 1950s and early 60s, it was clearly geared possibly to a kind of gay audience. And there were very tight restrictions at that time of any sort of kind of queer pornography. So it kind of would make sense that this would be one avenue for that. But for the most part, they really are very wholesome. These magazines.
Yes, although I have to disagree slightly because I don't think you have a good gender balance or body type balance, and that wasn't necessarily what people were looking for. But you look at the magazines from the 60s, and you have a hard time finding one with a man on the cover.
There are very few with men on the cover. And I also will, and you're right, and I'll just jump in that the kind of, when I think of the sort of original nudist magazines like the Nudist from the 30s, and then it evolved into Sunshine and Health, the original versions of those magazines did have, overweight women in them and did have lots of men in them, and not in any sort of homoerotic way, but just like, people shoveling out a backyard to put in a pool or something, like sort of engaged in work. And when the magazines sort of fell under anti-obscenity laws were essentially banned, one of the judges in one of the famous cases said the reason why they were obscene was because the people in the magazines were not attractive. I mean, that was one of the reasons they were called out for being obscene, was because the judge, was a misogynist and didn't see overweight women as being attractive. So they did kind of shift. And in some ways it was to sort of match up with the strange and always changing anti-obscenity laws here. But also, I think, speaking to your point of being relatively sexist and then having these very sort of always young and very attractive women at the forefront. And you had spin-off magazines that tended to have more of that tended to look a lot more like girly mags, right, than Naturist magazines.
Yes, some went very, very far, and there was always a dichotomy. You don't necessarily see it in the magazines, but you do when you read the minutes of meetings of the various organizations, because the dichotomy was between serving the publisher's need for maximum amounts of advertising and circulation revenue, and serving the ideology that they were trying to promote. They needed the money, but it often was it was counter to what they were saying, and they recognized it.
Yes, they did. And I don't know how much you want to get into this here, but I mean, there were actual pornographers involved in like producing some of this imagery, certainly by the time we got to the early 1960s. But that's when no matter what they were producing for the nudist magazines, certainly in the early 70s, couldn't compete with things like what Bob Guccione started producing. So by the time you actually got into like hardcore pornography that could legally circulate in the U.S., no matter what you had in the Naturist magazines, that certainly flew in the face of any original intent and were becoming more sexualized, it seemed very, very tame. So thereby, the people who wanted the naked magazines as skin mags didn't need nudist magazines anymore. They could just go buy this other stuff. And in some ways that meant the death of the nudist magazine. It's a strange kind of irony, given that so many nudists and naturists early on were trying to define themselves as antithetical to that whole prurient sexual culture that was growing in the U.S. in the 20th century.
That's very interesting. So it seems like we have a little mini boom happening, because a little over a year ago you had, I don't know if you know, Stephen Harp published a book on nudism in France or naturism in France and the history there. And then just this year, Brian Hoffman did one on nudism in North America called Naked.
Yes.
And so it seems, and those are all very good scholarly books that are well researched and very interesting to read at the same time. So you're going to fit right in.
Thank you. And there's actually one more. There's another one. I think his name is John Williams. Do we have that right? It's about turning to nature in Germany. So there's a third one that has come out in the last couple of years. So in Germany, France, and we have Brian Hoffman's wonderful book on the United States. And he really is looking at the relationship of nudism in the United States to obscenity law, and also kind of institutional nudism. And so I think that my book will sort of broaden that story a little bit more by looking at nudism a little bit earlier and taking the story up a little bit later. And so, it is a boom. Actually, I have a question for you. Why do you think there's so much interest in this culture all of a sudden?
Well, see, I was going to ask you that question. Why are all these books coming out now? My theory, I'm reading these books. There is history. Most of these are history books, right? They're not philosophy books. In the beginning of the movement, they were philosophy books, ideas, ideologies, that kind of thing. Now we have history. I mean, we're looking in, a lot of clubs and resorts in the United States and Canada have been around 50 years or more, and you're looking at almost a century since the first one started. So I think there is history. It's a topic that's just kind of grabs attention and is it's an endlessly fascinating topic for our society because we have this thing about we're interested in nudity, we're told we're not supposed to be and we're not supposed to do it, but we like it and we pay to see it. So we're always having this dichotomy in our brains and our minds about it. So it always makes for interesting material. People are fascinated by it. Hence also this whole series of television shows, right? The Naked Survival one. We have Buying Naked. We have Dating Naked. It's television shows. So yeah, I don't know. I guess even from an academic standpoint, there is a lot of stuff to study now. I suspect, right?
I think so. I mean, no, I'm just really was curious what you thought because I agree with you completely. I mean, part of it is that we have a century's worth of history to look back upon. I think there's also so much interest in it too, both as academically, but also for people who are practicing it, because our culture which has become so much more sexualized through the internet, through popular culture, through the easy access to pornography, and then by extension, a kind of pornographication of the society. And I think that in some ways, people are looking for moments in their own practice of their own lives, for moments when the body is not sexualized in the way that our culture and commodified the way our culture is hanging it out right now in our global economy. And I think that, and in some ways it's a throwback to the 20s and 30s where people felt that, the body was becoming too sexualized and they wanted to find ways in which they could express themselves and be free and natural without those hang-ups and without those pressures. And I feel like we're in another cycle of that. Does that make sense, even though the technologies are so radically different?
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with you because more than ever, we have, a society which is actually quite comfortable with nudity. I mean, you just watch any television show on HBO. It seems you can't do one without nudity, and it's pretty acceptable. You can now have ads that are, reruns are okay on billboards. Maybe we'll raise a few eyebrows, but not a big issue. But it's coming. It's coming with a huge amount of sexuality, but even if there is no sexuality, there's a big aspect of beauty myth associated with it. And what I see, the young people that come to Bare Oaks and are very interested in the movement is they're comfortable with the nudity. They want to just get away with the sexuality and objectification aspect.
Yes, I think absolutely. And when I've given talks about this material to students, undergrads and graduate students, I find that the students are just so blown away that they're like, wow, I show them pictures, of these kind of nudist environments where people have dinner parties and everyone's naked. And they're like, these kids are so startled that you could have this naked environment that wasn't a sexual space. It's both mind-blowing to them that that's possible and so appealing to them. And I realized, wow, like our culture has become, the body's become so objectified that the younger generation, I think, feels quite alienated from their own skin. And so that's one of the reasons why it seems so appealing to them. And I guess partially what's happening with all this academic outpouring is that we're not that far removed from it ourselves, and so therefore it has this personal interest as well as an academic one.
There are old clubs that young people just don't feel welcome because there's very old-fashioned rules. No holding hands, and you've got to be interviewed before you're allowed in, and then you have to join. And the younger generation doesn't want to join things. There was a couple this summer that I was talking to, and I said, you've been here so many times, you've paid for a membership. I'll just flip that over and make it a membership, and you can keep coming, and then it doesn't cost you anything. And you go, no, we don't really want to belong to anything. It's like, wow.
Wow.
Okay, I'll keep taking your money because we don't limit the number of day visits because what's the difference?
But that's so fascinating, but not wanting to join anything. Like there's something sad about that to me.
Yeah, well, people issue labels, right, to a certain extent, and that's part of the problem. You don't want to necessarily call yourself that. It's complicated. We're very much more complicated than we used to be. The society was much more homogeneous before. So
endlessly fascinating.
Yes, I have one last question for you. You said you're not a naturist or a nudist. You obviously spent a lot of time at the American Nudist Research Library at Cypress Cove in Florida. You never took the opportunity to go for a skinny dip or a swim or anything?
Oh, no. I would say, well, this is the thing. I have participated in, I would guess, nudist activities, I think, much of my life, but I didn't think of it as being particularly unusual. So, sure, skinny dipping with friends in lakes where I grew up was a pretty normal thing to be doing. And I had been, naked at concerts and have been to nudist colonies or camps and resorts. That happened really kind of after my research started. So I was kind of doing that more self-consciously. But I don't consider myself a practicing nudist because I don't organize my life around being naked. That's the distinction I would make. But I also don't necessarily think of myself as a recreational nudist because I don't plan all of my vacations around it either. And so therefore I just sort of feel like I don't in some ways I don't feel absorbed into the culture, even though the culture certainly seems happy to absorb me, but it's not that I don't feel excluded from it. So yeah, but no, I've definitely partaken, but that just seemed like a natural thing to be doing. I mean, I guess maybe for me it was more of a bohemian hippie thing than a nudist thing. And so one of the things that was so fascinating was how, to me, about nudist culture and studying it in the United States, going back to the 1930s, was how careful about categories people were. Like, we're thinking about trying to define what this was, right? Like the domestic nudist and the recreational nudist and the card-carrying nudist. And for me, in some ways, it was by necessity that people had to do that. And in my experience, and this is one of the things I'm really interested in studying, but it's very difficult, is like, how do people sort of imagine naked living, but without all of those categories and perhaps without the memberships and without, the institutionalized framework. And I don't know, that's actually very difficult to study because, there's no archive of that, just how people just live.
Well, it becomes more of a sociological study that you have to do at that point, and that you have to go in the field. Yes. That's
a very different thing. And people did do that in the 70s. They did a lot of sociologists studied nude beach culture, and that was a place where that type of work was done. And I went to graduate school in San Diego and made a very famous nude beach called Black's, which I frequented. And that was also rather eye-opening. But I don't remember thinking of it as nudist culture per se. It happened to be a space where you could be naked. I don't know if that makes any sense.
If I can summarize, you've been to nude beaches, you've been to naturist nudist clubs, you've done other nude type of activities. You're very comfortable with you and others, obviously, then being nude. You have studied the movement, probably know more about it than a lot of nudists and naturists do, actually. And you are, I would suspect, believe in the core values, whether you call themselves that or not, which is of, body acceptance of yourself and others, and perhaps living a little bit more naturally. Does that make sense?
Sure.
So
yes, absolutely.
How are you not a naturist?
I don't know. Perhaps I am. Maybe I'm suffering from false consciousness.
Well, is it that you don't want to have the label?
No, it's not even that. I have tremendous respect for people who call themselves nudists, and because of what I've studied and experienced, that it does come with a certain degree of labor, right? I mean, it is making sure some people are a member of these organizations and participating in them, and communicating with other people in your network of nudists, and involving oneself in freeing a beach here and there, and being really, really very active politically and socially within one's nudist kind of circle, however small or big that might be. And I don't really do that. And so for me to claim the identity, I feel like I'd be posing. I would feel like a that I'm taking on a title I don't deserve.
Well, yeah, but I think that's you perhaps have a slight bias because you, in your research, have been dealing with a lot of the leaders of the movement who are, of course, by definition, therefore, highly, highly involved. But I would say that I've met a lot of people who call themselves naturists and nudists who are less experienced and less committed than you are.
Well, then maybe I am a nudist, Stefan, and I just have to embrace my identity, in which case I'm happy to do so.
Hey, there you go.
You've gotten another one.
I have. I'll send your card in the mail.
Thank you. This will be great. I look forward to it. It'll be a nice Christmas gift.
Yes, well, but see, that's one of the things is the ideology. Maurice Parmelee, as you know, wrote the first English language book on the movement, and it did a really good job of it. And what he described is something you can do while fully clothed. You don't have to be nude to be a naturist, and that's one of the differences.
Right.
In Europe, you would never say nudist; you would say naturist, or people would talk about practicing nudism within naturism, or as Parmelee called it, gymnosophy. So when you're fully dressed, you can still be a naturist because it's how you view the world, right?
It's true, actually. Lewis Mumford, I think, is a good, because he was a contemporary of Maurice Parmelee. Of course, Lewis Mumford, the public intellectual and urban planner in the U.S. And he was really quite fascinated by nudism, and proposed nude beaches in some of the cities for which he did park plans. Honolulu was a famous example of this, and he did not consider himself a nudist, and I'm not sure to what extent he practiced it, but he certainly had a very strong sense of relationship between nature and technology, and in fact had a term called biotechnics for that. So he was kind of, so in some ways I feel like I identify a little bit more with Lewis Mumford, where, I mean, if I stumble on a new beach, I will participate in nudity there, but somehow intellectually just somehow don't think of myself as a participant. Although I really wanted to find out that Lewis Mumford was in fact a nudist, so I thought, what a coup for my book, but I have not been able to find any evidence of it. I can't. I'm not going to do it now when the man has been dead for over 20 years, or even more so at this point.
But what would it take to determine that he was? He just chose not to identify that way.
Yeah, and I certainly, in all of the many volumes that he wrote, didn't describe anything I would understand as being nudist living. He didn't. There weren't any of these examples of designing his house or living nakedly. But the fact that he was interested in having nude beaches written into design plans for, I mean, he was clearly aware of it and was thinking along the lines of like the health benefits and social benefits of, shedding one's clothing. And that would make a lot of sense for someone like Lewis Mumford, who was very interested in social democracy.
This has been an issue that's been interesting since the very beginning that I got involved. A quick sort of how I got involved in the movement is when I was in university, we'd go skinny dipping when we were camping or at friends' cottages, and I'd enjoyed so much I became the initiators. People started calling me a nudist, and I looked into it, and I visited, as a result of my research, which was hard to do, by the way, without the internet back then, I found a place to go, and I liked it. I chose to adopt the label, but then I discovered all these people who, some were calling themselves naturists and some nudists. And then because my mother's from Belgium and I go to Europe, I discovered over there they call themselves naturists far more, but in some ways are less naturist based on what I'd been reading than people call themselves nudist in the United States. And you start to realize that I have friends who call themselves vegetarians and eat chicken.
It is interesting, and a lot of this stuff is I'm going to work some of this out in the book, or at least try to. Sometimes nudism was really, I'm looking at this one set of cases of these particular men in the interwar period between the First and Second World War, who went out to the desert to kind of play Indian, basically, and sort of like get back to nature and like live how the American Indians did. And it was kind of a popular thing, particularly with European immigrants, to do this. And some of them spent a lot of time like photographing themselves and then publishing these pictures in magazines that were not nudist magazines, but just kind of like booster magazines for the region, or versions of like National Geographic. And it was kind of this very sort of public display of the body and this alternative way of living. And then in some certain cases, the way they actually lived was very traditional, frankly, not particularly nudist and not even really back to the land. But there was this kind of effort to kind of present this public persona of kind of rugged living. And I find that really interesting as well.
Well,
I don't know.
It is interesting. And it's even this whole concept of natural is interesting, because what is natural? Like, so I could say that, being ashamed, embarrassed, and offended by your own image is not natural. Therefore, when I am comfortable with my body being naked, that's natural, and that's all that's as far as I'm going. So sitting, drinking beer in a the resort's restaurant nude is more natural, but then some people say, well, that's not natural. The place is paved and it's concrete everywhere, because they have this idea that natural means that you have to be uncomfortable almost before you're natural.
Right, that natural has to be uncomfortable. And then I've also given talks where I've shown some pictures from the magazines, and some of the ones that really catch people's eye are pictures of nudists in the American Midwest who are skiing in snow in the nude. And people say, well, how is that a natural thing to be doing? Because at any time in history, people would have not wanted to be cold. And so it's deeply unnatural. So the notion of natural is an interesting one, and one that's, I think, also really problematized by consumer culture, because you think of all the things that are sold to us in the name of being natural beauty, natural youth, right? Like, and the things that we're then supposed to do to achieve that, which are not natural, like plastic surgery, for example, or lots of makeup, or these kinds of things. So that even the term natural has been kind of denatured. Yeah,
absolutely. And it can mean so many things to so many people. I mean, I drive an electric car. But I drive a car.
Yeah.
I believe I am being more, better on the environment. But of course, it would be better to ride a bicycle. But that's just a little too much for me, especially the winters are kind of tough in Toronto. So
you're off the hook.
But then you could be going back to living with horses and buggies and all that stuff too. So the natural thing is not well defined, and I think again, to the outside world, when they imagine nudists and naturists wanted to be more natural, and then seeing them taking cruise ships, they go, that's not natural. You guys are hypocrites.
Well, one of the things, I meant to mention earlier and neglected to do so, that one of the things that intrigued me about the fact that you had these nudist living experiments in suburbia was that it fit in with this idea or curiosity I had about how people imagine natural living in modern urban environments, right? Because that's the real question for me. It's not too difficult to imagine going naked or being natural, like in the woods. People going to a wilderness retreat or actually living in the woods and being kind of natural there. For example, like hunting your own food or trying to do this in some sort of anachronistic way, certainly if you're talking about the 20th century, but living in cities where you do have all the conveniences of modern life and then trying to be more natural in that space. That's a more interesting set of questions for me. And I think it's one that we're struggling with as a society now, whether it's about nudity or not, because all of our green living efforts, like you mentioned, the electric car, people swapping out all their light bulbs for more green options. A lot of this are solar power. Yeah. It's about trying to be more energy efficient, and energy efficient in many ways is a stand-in for kind of trying to live more naturally. And you see it in dietary practices, right? So many people becoming vegetarians, people becoming raw food enthusiasts. And if you look at the sort of discourse and the language people use, it's all about sort of natural food or natural living or real living, right? That would be another word people will use, living in a real way as opposed to some sort of unreal way. And I think some of it sure is marketing, but a lot of it, I think people are truly struggling with these things. Really trying to figure out how are we going to survive on our little planet. It's hard
to there's no solution. And on my other side, I have this business. We do education for architects online, and we're very involved with the U.S. Green Building Council and LEED. That's a very big topic for education. And people criticize it because it's not perfect, but there is no perfect solution. At least it's something.
Yes.
What I like about LEED is it doesn't try to tell you you have to do it this way. It gives you points. So, you could have a lot of points by making a whole bunch of electric parking spots in your parking lot, but have a building which is not that well insulated. You could still end up with a good number of points because you reuse the flush, the toilets, and when you flushed them. Everything's compromise. And now we're learning, of course, in cities that intensification of cities and urbanization is actually better for the environment than sprawling out and destroying all the countryside.
Exactly right. That in fact it is better to kind of imagine us living in a hive, right? Like the hive of the city than it is to sprawl out, which has been absolutely devastating environmentally and economically. I mean, we have many examples of that. And in some ways that was actually Louis Mumford's original set of ideas in the 1930s, was that people should live in cities, that that's where we belong. So that's our natural state, not.
Yes, so it's very interesting. So this is part of an upcoming book.
Yes, it is. I am delighted that I'm going on sabbatical in just a few days, really, and we'll be spending the next 8 months finishing up this book that's going to look at naked living experiments in the United States, looking at the desert, looking at the beaches, looking at camps and colonies, and, of course, looking at naked suburbia, of which this essay is a big part.
So if you want to read the article from Sarah, you can, but you can't just download it from the internet, because journal articles, either you have to pay for them or you have to have access to subscriptions. Now, I'll provide the link in the show notes, and I'll tell you the details of the article itself. And if you want, you can pay. It's a few bucks to get the article itself. Alternatively, though, I would imagine a lot of libraries, certainly would imagine most university libraries, or college, as it's called in the U.S., would have access to the journal article. But I imagine a lot of city or town libraries might have access to it as well through a computer system. Most libraries now, you use your library card, and through your computer at home, you can access a wealth of resources. These articles many of them are not printed anymore. The journals are just published electronically and are part of these massive databases. So I'll provide a link, and hopefully you can get to it and have a chance to read it. But please don't ask me to send it to you, because that would be a violation of copyright, and I'm trying to respect the fact that people are working and trying to make money publishing these things, and I hope you do as well. So that's all for this episode of the Naturist Living Show, and the first episode edited and put together by Sean Mitchell. So thank you, Sean, for making my life easier and making it possible to have more frequent shows and more frequent episodes. Again, my name is Stéphane Deschênes. I'm your host for this podcast and the owner of Béroque's Family Naturist Park. Please keep sending your comments and your suggestions. The show's email address is naturistliving@béroques.ca. That's B-A-R-E, of course, .ca, because we're in Canada. And the show's website, for those links I mentioned earlier, is naturistliving, one word, .béroques, B-A-R-E-O-A-K-S, .ca again. So you can also leave a comment. Feel free to call. You call the phone number for Béroques, which is either toll-free 1-888-373-9124 if you're in North America, or country code 1-905-473-6060, or through Skype. Just Béroques is our Skype name. And that will put you in the main phone system for Béroque's Family Naturist Park. And the show's extension is extension 333. You can record it as many times. You can erase it and start over again, and you can delete it if you're not happy. So no pressure. But if you'd like to record a comment, I would be happy to put it on the show. So join us again in a little while for the next episode of the Naturist Living Show.
This episode of the Naturist Living Show was brought to you by Bare Oaks Family Naturist Park. Traditional naturist values in a modern setting. Traditional values means that naturism is more than just taking your clothes off. It is a life philosophy with physical, psychological, environmental, social, and moral benefits. Bare Oaks Family Naturist Park strives to promote those naturist values in a modern setting that provides the amenities and services that our members and visitors expect. Free your body, free your mind. Learn more at www.baroques.ca.